All right, a few of you stuck around, so that's awesome. We did pretty well. Thank you. So now, with material design, we said it's a really big topic. In fact, this is the only session that has a double session at Evolve. Because to us, I mean, as Android developers, I've been an Android developer for 3 years. I think for you, Jeremy?
Probably 4 or 5 years, yeah.
4 or 5 years. For me, it is my favorite platform. I love every aspect of how messed up and weird it is, but so much you can do with it. It's so powerful under the hood. So really, material design is so much and so big and so fundamental to when L releases this fall for developers that we need to take advantage of it now. And we mentioned earlier that the L developer preview is available now for Xamarin developers in the alpha channel. And what makes that important is that, that we can now upgrade all of our applications to adhere to these guidelines. And in Google themselves, what's interesting about this release being a developer preview, it's not going to be like other versions of Android. Other versions of Android, basically I/O happened, and they said, here you go. Right? KitKat came out over a year ago, and it's only at 25% maybe of the market. And that, to me, is almost the fastest growing version of Android that's out there. So when we think about how this will be released, it goes through an extensive cycle with all OEMs. I think this is another important aspect why this concept and design is so important. Because when Android L releases, it won't just be the Nexus 5 and the Nexus 7 from what Google has said. They're working with the OEMs to make upgrade buttery smooth. Now, of course, you got the carriers, but you'll see what happens.
Actually, to give you even an idea on that, I didn't specify that I should probably have. But when I talked earlier, if you were in the session, about the new shadow system, this is actually a shadow system that you would think is very resource hungry, and it is indeed. I mean, they did everything they could to accelerate, but it's still a very resource sensitive piece of the system. And so, but still, they went to enough length to optimize these two. They said the reference device that they had to develop this on was the Nexus 7 first generation. So this means that, for better or worse, this is the kind of class of device they're optimizing for.
Exactly. So in the first session, let me turn this on. There we go. The first session, we covered material, the first two aspects of material design. The bold, intentional theming and colors and accents that we can use to really bring vibrancy to our applications. And also the entire metaphor of what does material design mean with papercraft and print type. And now we can leverage a lot of new attributes and a few controls and libraries to bring that to life. And this session, part 2, is dedicated to just bringing our applications to life with motion and animations and a lot of the new things that are in Android and support libraries to enable that. One thing that's not on this slide that's so important about material design that I had a question about earlier was backwards compatibility. And I'm going to deep dive into that with a few slides and show you how you can support and add all these new features without messing up your current application today.
We also probably touch on a bit on this distribution challenges that you may have with L applications today and how it's going to evolve.
Let's go jump here.
All right. So, so motion, I mean, if you have seen my work, if you have seen the talks I've given, if you see what I work on, you must know that I am probably the most interested in animation guy ever. This is what I like about Android. This is what I like to push to the limit. This is where I like to push the system to the limit. And so when I saw the first release of material design, I was super excited because motion, never again in a specification, I have seen people going as far into the motion aspect as Google did with material design. So you have seen with our demo of L, there's a couple of things that they've added to the default controls to bring, to change, every state is animated, there's subtle animation everywhere, transition are perfectly smooth. And so we're going to try to deep dive into all those aspects in one go. So first, let's talk about touch feedback. So by touch feedback, I mean anything that is triggered as part of a user interaction with control on the screen. So the first one that you have seen, and this is throughout the system, is the idea of the ripple. So where controls and bits on the screens are, the metaphor here is paper and pieces of paper that are laid on top of each other. Touch interaction and what the user do on the screen is imagined as ink. If you drop a little droplet of ink on paper, the effect is that the ink is going to slowly, in a circle movement, spread out through the paper. And so they have tried to emulate this by using the ripple effect. And so on an Android system now by default for L, every control, so buttons, checkboxes, anything that accepts a touch event has now by default baked in this ripple effect.
Yeah, they were really going for the whole paper thing.
Yes.
That was really, I mean, and it's really interactive and all. Now, of course, paper's not going to do spirals and rotations, but I think really the ripple, just being out of the box, upgrading our themes to enhance and bring the ripple effect here is the first thing that's going to make applications pop.
Yeah. So this part of the session is going to be very much code-oriented, so we don't have that much slide. So I'm going to go back to the demo application. And so, as I said, pretty much every system element, the system level that accept touch, have by default this idea of ripple. So when I click here, you can see that a ripple, also very important is that since, as I said, the idea of touch is this idea of a droplet of ink falling on paper, it's important that this ripple effect starts where I touch. And so if you notice here, no matter where I click, always the epicenter of the effect is always where I just tapped. Take a couple of times here.
Now, also, there's what's interesting here on at least this default button. You zoom in. What happens if someone was to press really hard on it, right? So you long press on it. And notice it's a completely different animation because that ink would be hitting it completely different and dispersing. So they have even taken into account the touch and how hard someone is pressing on that into all of our controls. So is it a quick tap or a long press?
Exactly. So again, as I said, by default, the system provided views implement that by default, so you don't have to do a lot of work to tap into that aspect. But if you want to, if you have custom views, for instance, where you want to implement this effect, it's also very easy. There's basically two forms of the ripple. There is one that is called constraint, and so in this mode, the system is going to take the clipping rectangle of your views. So if you have a button like this, which is a square button, you can see that the ripple doesn't go beyond the edge of the view and is limited to it. So that's one aspect. And then there is another aspect that is primarily used, for instance, if you remember the calculator demo when we tapped on the digits, here there is no constraint anymore. The ripple has all the space in it to actually fill up and stay a circle. And so this is what I've implemented here in these two custom views here. The square one here, as you can see, the ripple is being constrained by this rectangle that you don't see, but that is there because this is an image view. And so it's being clipped by that all the time. Whereas on this version here, I am using an unrestrained ripple, which basically amounts to the same thing, but the end result is that the ripple has all the space you need to expand as a circle.
Yeah, notice that you touched outside of that bounding box, and then the ripple's not there, but the ripple can actually expand really far.
Exactly. And so what's also interesting, and this is, I don't know if this is going to be used really, but what's interesting is that you can also, and they're adding that to more pieces of the system, but what they're doing is that you can also now use bitmaps, not only as bitmaps, but also as mask, as bitmap mask.
Yeah, this is really cool.
This is really cool. So basically here, on this button here, I have used an image that I have here. I'm going to show you. I have my, oh, this is your demo. This image of, since we are at Xamarin, I obviously chose a monkey.
Naturally. I mean, cats are cool.
Exactly. So this is the image of a monkey that I'm using in my app. And so the first thing you need to notice is that this is entirely black. So the only pieces of the image are either a black color or a transparent color. And so when I use this in my app and I set that as a mask, the ripple is actually going to use it to clip onto that. And so I'm not exactly sure how this is going to be useful in real-life application, but I thought it was really cool to just
honestly, I mean, like I said, cats are great. Monkeys are way cooler. I'm just going to use this code in every single one of my buttons. I mean, problem solved.
I'm sure you're going to feel more.
I'm pretty sure that everyone wants to click a button and see a monkey there. I mean, that's...
Watch out for next year Evolve app.
Yeah,
you're going to see
I know.
monkeys like that everywhere.
Perfect. It doesn't sound like a problem to me. So.
And so this is actually one of the aspects that is very also easy to implement. So I showed you a couple of custom views, but it's very easy to implement. So what Google did is that they added two theme attributes that you can use directly in your layout. Here, so well, this is my view here. And so if I go to, let me remove this. So if I go to where I implement my two buttons here, I have my bread cat here and my tortilla cat, which I thought were perfect explanation for the square and round nature of my drawable. So there is two new attributes here. So the first one, if you remember, I said it was a constrained ripple. So the idea here is that the ripple is going to see what exactly the bounds of your view is, and I'm going to take that into account to clip itself when it expands. So the way you use this is that you can set the background, which is available on any view. You set the background to this Android attribute selectable item background. And automatically, this is going to create the right type of ripple drawable, because it's called a ripple drawable. and apply it directly to your background. This is going to also dynamically get the touch event so that the epicenter of the ripple always starts from the touch point where you touch the item. And so the second one is very similar. The only change is essentially that the selectable item background is now borderless. And this is going to create the second effect, where the ripple is not affected by the bounds of the view and just takes all the space to spread out.
And Android made it very, Google made it really easy to remember these names. Who doesn't remember selectable item background borderless? And you got to put that special question mark too, because that is an Android-specific property. And I really want to point out one thing as to why this works. It's because we're using an image button. And an image button is clickable by default. So if you're using just an image, you could just set the clickable property on it. And that will enable this ripple effect in the background. So that's an important aspect. So while you might not do anything with the clickable property, that's what's going to enable it. So we're using an image button, because why not? But really, make sure you're using these specific Android attributes with that question mark flag.
Yeah, exactly. So this is what you call a theme lookup, so that it's dependent on the theme. Yeah, for the other story, actually, yeah, this is actually implemented. If you have done buttons before with Android, you know that you're not supposed to use either a static drawable or a color. You're supposed to use something that is called a list, a state list, which is going to have a different variation of your background depending on what the user is doing. So the user is touching, you get a feedback of a change of color, maybe a lighter color or something else. So this is the idea. This is implemented exactly in the same way. And so for my custom mask here, for my custom mask, I've actually done my own drawable. So I set the background the same way to a drawable here. So let's take a look at what exactly I did to replicate this ripple effect. So ripple can be created in code, but they can also be created in XML. This is what I have done here. So if I open up my monkey ripple, there is a new attribute, there is a new element type, which is called a ripple. And that allows you to create this ripple effect with anything you want. So the ripple at the framework level inherit from a layerless drawable, which means a layerless drawable is a way to stack several drawable together. And so you can use the same aspect here by using items. So the only difference here is that, so I have used exactly the same way they do. This is fairly similar to the default. So what you use by selectable item background, this is in the system implemented exactly like this XML file. So I've used exactly the same color, which is the color control highlight. I could use a different color. I could use one of the colors that we have shown before if you want to have something a little bit more poppy. And so this attribute here, Android color, is going to tint that wave that you have seen. Here I chose to follow the system default, so that's why it's the same color. But you could do anything you want here. And so the aspect here is that I said you can stack any type of drawable. But if you want to do a mask, there is this no specific ID that you can add that links to mask. And so when Android sees that, it's going to take the image not as an image per se, but it's going to take it as a black mask that is then going to clip on to the effect. This is why, at the end of the day, you see the monkey face appearing in the ripple. All right, so this is it for ripple. The second aspect, and this is linked to the shadow system that I talked about. So if you remember what I said earlier, the idea of the interface is that everything is a piece of paper that is stacked on top of each other. And so the metaphor that they have is that if you take a phone, would you please give me your phone?
You can borrow it for the whole day.
Thank you. So the whole concept of the stacking piece of paper is that if you take a phone like this, the idea is that the back of your phone is the ground. It's the elevation 0. And the glass of the screen, the surface of the screen, is something that is essentially the sky and very high, and you can't never reach it. But so the idea is that since you have those pieces of paper at definite level into the system, the idea that they want to do is that when a piece of paper, when you reach to touch a piece of paper and put that droplet of ink on it, again, this is designer talk, so this is very high level. But the idea is that the paper is going to come up and reach for you to touch the sky, essentially.
Like the paper's reaching out as you come down to
exactly
touch
from the ground to the sky. And so they call that ink response. And so you can see on the video here.
In the middle.
Whoop, no. This video here.
There we go.
So this is a stack of card. And so when I touch, the elevation of the view is going to increase as if to reach my finger. And so again, since this is an elevation, this is computed dynamically by the Android system. The shadow that is cast by this card is going to increase automatically based on that. So this is what is ink response. So let's see how we do that.
And the cool part about those shadows, too, when we dive into code is since I've set the elevation, which we talked about in the first session, the system's going to handle it, and we don't have to worry about it. Right? We don't have to worry about how is that being hardware accelerated, or am I setting the light correctly, or setting the correct drop shadow. It just works.
Exactly. So here I have this stack of card, and so notice that this is actually using CardView, one of the other components that James is going to show later, which implement a custom, which implement Google kind of official way to design card-based layout that James is going to cover later. And so we had a question earlier actually about how does the shadow react when you have something that is not square and something that doesn't take the whole space? Well, this is the case here. So my card here has rounded corner here, as you can see a little bit here. And so the shadow is also going to follow the same pattern. So if I zoom here, you can discern a little bit that, yeah, the shadow is also following the rounded corner aspect of the card. So the idea here is that if I have this list of cards here, when I reach to touch one of them, not only do you get the ripple, because again, remember, this is thing you can touch, so the ripple should be there. But if you can see, the entire card seems to come to me and reach me. And this translates essentially to that, to an elevation, an increase in elevation.
Can you zoom in here a little bit on the in between? So remember we had those seams before. If you dive really into like the Xamarin Rebirth, notice that now you can notice at the very tip of it that is elevating above the other items in our list, so that Xamarin Rebirth monkey there actually has a little bit of shadow that's overcasting on top of it, because we're raising above the other elements.
Exactly, and this is all over the elements.
It's all handled automatically for us.
Exactly. And so the astute reader may have remembered what I just said earlier about the fact that the ripple needs to come from the touch point. And so as you can see here, it is not coming from the touch point. This is a known issue. This is why it's a preview. And Google said they fixed it, so this should be fixed in the final release. But so that's why when we said that this thing was on the alpha channel, it's for a good reason. It's still a preview. So this is not meant for production. This is not meant for production. All right. So the way we do this is that, so the same way we have this idea of state for buttons, as I mentioned earlier, this idea that when you touch a button, the background should change to something else to give a feedback to the user. This idea of elevation that changes across time is also implemented in the same way, also react to the same type of events. And so they have created something else called a stateless animator, like here. So this is not replacing a background. You don't set that as a background. There is a new property for it. But the way you do this is that you use a selector, like you used to, with a set of items that have a combination of state. And so the idea is that when you do something on an item, the system is going to pick the item that has the state that corresponds to what you just did. So in my case here, when I press my view, I want to trigger an animation. And so you can do anything you want, but for the matter of ink response, as I said, the idea is that we're going to increase the base elevation of my card. And so notice too that I'm not starting from 0. I'm actually starting from 2 deep, which is also the standard value where cards. So this is also detailed in the specification. Card must start at an elevation of 2 dp so that they cast an initial shadow. So what I'm doing is that I'm taking this 2 dp value and raising it up to 6 dp, which is also the system provided elevation that an item should follow if you tap on it. So again, I specified here a constant version, but I expect that in the future, this is probably going to also be part of the framework, and you're just going to be able to reference those values directly from the framework. And so, so what I'm doing here is that when I click, I'm raising my view. So I go from 2 dp to 6 dp using this translation Z property that I said, which is the equivalent of elevation, but for animation purposes. And when I release the button or anything else happen, I do the reverse. I go from 6 dp to 2 dp back to where the view should normally be.
So if you've done selectors before, these states are going to feel very familiar to you. And you can do highlighted, and you can do a lot of different properties here as well. This is going to be your standard, where we go from 2 to 6 dip. And of course, you can specify the duration. So if you do want something to go a little bit higher and take a little bit longer, you can do that as well. In translation Z there, that's the new property that doesn't exist before L in material design. Exactly.
And so again, so as I said, this is not a background, because the background here, in the same way than the other, is my ripple that I've shown you before, that I just forgot to specify before. But so the way you then state this selector is that you go into your layout. My ink response. And so this is using, as I said, this new widget called CardView that James is going to cover a little bit later, which is also part of the support package, which has some implication that he's going to show later about compatibility. But so as James mentioned in the previous session, a card by default is not clickable. So again, this entire aspect of feedback is only valid if your view is clickable. So what I did is that I just added the clickable attribute, which makes it possible. And so there is now this new property here called a stateless animator, where you can pass the XML file I just showed you before. And this is what is going to track for you state. So you don't have to do it yourself. You don't have to set up a click handler that's going to start the animation like you would do in previous version. All that is going to handle by the system. Specifically, for instance, imagining that a user press on the card, but then remove his finger right away. You don't have to worry about the fact that you need to cancel the animation and retrigger the other one. All of that, and especially taking into account the fact that it's in an intermediate state, all of that is going to be handled by the system for you, which is really cool.
And notice that he specifies the foreground. You know, we said we were talking about the background before, but we're specifying the foreground as a selectable item background, which seems a little counterintuitive. When you think about it, the card view is just a container for a bunch of information. So you want to set the background actually on top of everything, so the ripple is not impacted by anything else inside that layout. So that's why the foreground there is selected.
Exactly. And this is where the bug is right now, so that when you set a ripple as a foreground, Android doesn't take into account the touch point. So this is fixed normally in, this will be fixed in the final version. All right. And so the last one, the last aspect of touch feedback that they had in, and this is also very nice, although it's a little bit more, I guess a little bit more complicated to use, but it has very nice implication, is that they have added what they call radial action. So the idea of a radial action is that before, when you had a button or a checkbox, a radio button or anything like that that had two states, Android only had a finite set, two sets of drawable or bitmap that would correspond to each state. And so there was no animation that could be made between the two because this is a bitmap, so there is no way to interpolate between those two values. So they're changing that now in L, and what you can do now is that you can specify a keyframe animation using several versions of bitmaps so that you can have an animation that goes from one point to the other. And so this is expressed here, and this makes really nice effect, like navigation-wise, for instance, when you have an hamburger button in your main view, but then when you navigate to maybe other activities, when you want to go back, this hamburger button can morph naturally into the back button, because they're also adding a back button contrary to what they did before.
Yeah, it's a small but subtle enhancement to the applications
Exactly.
that are out there. Instead of just, I tap play and it just pops over to pause, you know, adding this little subtle animation can really help just breathe a little.
Delighting your user, the same way Xamarin delight
yeah.
developers, this is a way to delight your users for very simple and subtle animations.
Can we see an example of this?
Oh, yeah. All right, so as I mentioned, and as you have seen in the demo before, one of the cool aspects is that this thing is used for a lot of custom control. So if I use checkbox here, not only do I see the ripple, again, this is a common theme, again, that a ripple, any touchable item use a ripple. Notice that when I click on my checkbox here, the states in between are slowly going between each other. And so in the case when I check, you can see that not only the color kind of seems to fade from the edges, but also the check mark seems to be coming from the center. Same way for radio button, but also showcasing two different aspects is that not only when I click on this radio button here, again, color seems to be fading from the edge, and then the center circle seems to be popping from the center. But when you deselect the button, you have a reverse animation which follows the opposite way. And so all of that is implementable for you too. And so here I did a custom button, which is an alternation between a plus and a minus state, something that you often do. For instance, going back to our Xamarin Evolve app, you could add a session to a favorite, but then as soon as you add the session to a favorite, you may want to have a remove button that follows suit. So the idea here is that in the same way, ripple again, but in the same way, I want to alternate and I want to animate between my two states here by having several of those guys together. And so another aspect that is interesting here is that I want you to notice before I delve into the code is that I use two different colors. I use a green color for the plus sign, and I use a red color for the red sign. But what's interesting is that the color actually changes in the middle, but I'm using it in two different, the animation goes both ways. So now you may be wondering, did I have to generate 2 times my asset? So remember, this is a keyframe animation. So for this animation, I think I have maybe 8 pictures. So there's 8 pictures that goes in between each state. So did that mean I had to generate 8 times 2 for 2 colors my umbrella asset? No, there is a trick to it.
Because that would really be tedious.
That would really be tedious.
The designer comes to you and they say, hey, we want this button. Now you're like, oh, great, now I got to draw this as a 9 patches, this, you know, just, it's an easier way of doing assets. This is really cool.
Exactly. And so let me show you first, so I talked about keyframe animation, so let me show you first exactly what I mean by that. So if I go to one of my drawable here, you can notice that for my button add and remove, I don't have one item, but I have indeed 6 items.
Can you zoom in on that for us real quick?
Yeah.
There we go. There we go. So we do have a few items, but notice that it's 1 to 0, so we can go ahead and flip through these really quick.
Exactly. So if I open here the content of my folder, here are all my buttons. And so if I switch between them quickly here with a preview, you can see that I reproduce the same effect that you see on the screen slowly, is that the plus button, the top of the plus button slowly morph and fade back into the minus sign. But also notice something. The same way I showed you the monkey image before, this image is entirely black. Not red, not green, but entirely black. And so the reason for this is that Android is now adding a way to apply dynamic tinting to your application. I had a question earlier when James was showing the palette aspect of the new support package, and he was asking, this is great. I mean, you are changing the colors of every element, the action bar, the status bar, etc. But what about my bitmaps? What about all my icons? What is going to happen to them? So this is why we now have this tinting abilities that you can also freely tint any bitmap that you have in your application, provided that they're entirely black and transparent. You can tint them at runtime the way you want.
Additionally, this is interesting because as you dive into this code, now this image, if we apply a tint property, it might have actually been one of those gingerbread, glossy shenanigans going on back in the day. So applying a tint, since it's a drawable, will flatten it out. So if you actually had a plus button, it would actually flatten it out. Now using a black color like this allows us to create one asset, not have to worry about the color, and we can specify it in code and create beautiful things like this transition.
Exactly. And so this is a selector, so this is set as a background. If you have used selector before, again, to have different bitmap corresponding to different state, this should look familiar to you. The only difference here is that instead of just selector, this is now becoming an animated selector. And this tells the system that this is not a simple selector, but something that has animation baked in for each different state. And so as a normal selector, you find the same ID of having different state. So here, my button is actually the plus, the minus, and plus button that I showed before is actually not just a button, but a checkbox. So it has a state check that is associated to it. So what you would do before is that you would probably directly put a drawable or a bitmap or anything like that directly for that state. So what I do here instead is that I reference the 2 extremum values of my images, which are the plus sign here and the minus sign here at the bottom. So these are my extremum states. And so as you can see here, I'm directly applying, using this new attribute called tint. So I can use it in XML, you can use it in code. This is available both on drawable, on bitmap, on pretty much anything that display pixels, where you can apply any tint you want. And so I'm using here, let me fade back here. And so this is here I assume, this is my minus. So this is why I color it by red. And this is my plus button, so I color it green. And so also notice that a new thing, because you didn't do that before, but now you can add an ID. So put a reference onto a specific state so that you can reference it later. And the reason for that is that there is now this new element called a transition. And so by doing a transition like that, you can specify a starting point, like you would do in a normal animation, a specific point, and then a destination point. And now in between, you're going to have animation list. And so in this animation list, you're going to be able to specify all the keyframe of your animation. So this is why I was saying that this is a little bit more work than a normal animation, because since the Android system is not smart enough to interpolate between your 2 values, it's your job or your designer job to generate all those assets together. So there's a couple of ways you can do that, and this is kind of out of the scope, but I can tell you if you want, if you come to me later. And so again, as I mentioned, so I have 2 transitions here, because I can go from the plus button to the minus button, but then I can revert back to from the minus button to the plus button. And so that's why I have 2 transitions. So my transition here is from the add state to the remove state, and just below, as you can expect, I have a transition from the remove state to the add state. And what's interesting is what I told you earlier. Since I can tint freely all my assets, it means that in my second animation here, if I, for instance, pick the keyframe tree here, I'm applying a green color that you can see here. But if I go to my top animation, that same tree here is actually colored red. So the idea is that as I am in my animation, when I'm in the middle keyframe, then suddenly I want to swap out the tinting that I'm using. But I didn't have to generate 2 assets. Again, this is just a black asset, and I could tint it the way I want when I want it. Yes, we have a question, I guess.
Going from green to red, there's no like interpolation like an orange in between.
No, there
There's no interpolation. The question was, is there interpolation of color? And no, there's not.
No, so right now there's no interpolation on those values. Maybe this is something they're going to add later. That would actually, yeah, be really.
That would be nice, yeah. So it's a little bit. It's not quite like a interpolator in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is the reason why when James was showing all the theming that you can do, and you did notice that every piece of the system, like the radio buttons and checkboxes, were following the color that it was setting. This is the reason. Every one of those animations that the system by default has is a black asset, and so they use the same tinting ability to take that value, to extract that value from your theme, and apply it like that.
All right. Well, we're about to dive over to me anyway, so that's good, and they'll fix his mic up really quick. Standard mic. Cool. So that's one part of touch feedback, but of course I want to talk about a few other things if I can get out. There we go. So I really want to talk about transitions and animations and movements. And there's 3 distinct points that I'll dive into. Is activity transitions, which looks something like this. Ooh, pretty. That's completely doable here. We select an image and everything pops out and fades in. Let's first look at that. It's really simple, actually. Out of the box, there's a few of different transitions that we can use. So I've gone ahead and we'll see my list back in my demo here. There we go.
And personally, this is something. Oops, sorry. And personally, this is something I'm very, very excited about because those kind of transition used to be very difficult to do. But as James is going to show you, this is now very nice and very simple to do.
So there's a few transitions built for us out of the box that we can take advantage of. And the first one is called Explode, which I love. So here again, we saw some transitions if you're in part 1 from this base nectar list of albums that I could select through and then dive in deeper. But watch what happens when I select an album. I'll go back again one more time here. Back and forth. All of my items on my entire page are animated, exploding off the page and being animated back in. The beautiful part about this is about 4 lines of code. So I'm on my first animation activity here on Explode. And what I've done is I request a feature from the window, which is content transitions, this new property exposed in L. And then you can say an enter or an exit transition, and I'm going to specify explode. And there's a few different ones. There's a few other properties that you can set, such as allow exit transition overlap, so they overlap on top of each other to make them buttery smooth. But I set those to true just because I like it. It seems a little bit smoother. Now on the page, when I dive into the details from the master detail, oops, there we are, I do the same exact thing. And now Android will automatically transition and explode to and from these pages. So when I come in, I explode not only out of, but into. That's it. That's all I did. It's great. But it gets a little bit better, because what if I took this list and I said, I know I'm selecting a specific album. Let's say this one down here. What if I could animate just from that item, take that bitmap, and I know where it's going to be on the next page? So what if I could transition to and from? And notice that it comes back to life there from the bottom.
And this is a trend, like time and time, I think I've repeated, others have repeated, animation are not just for showing off. It's actually a cue, an interesting cue for the user to see what is happening now. And so this example of having the album cover going from the position it is and the position that the user has tapped, so this is a direct user action, onto the main content, like taking more brief, is a following of that philosophy.
Now in this instance, we'll get it to the end. I really want to try to jam in some, and we'll be around after as well. So what I do here is it's very similar, except for instead of explode, I say move image. Now when I move image, this tells Android that I have specified a specific ID for the element that I'm transitioning from and to. So if I go ahead and look at one of my layouts for each of those cells, that grid item that I have here, we can see I'm using a CardView again. And inside of it, I have a custom image view that I use. Regardless, it's an image view. And I specify this new property called view name. That's my album. Now, on the transition part that I have here, I specified the same view name for Android. So that's my master and detail page here, and that's the item in the list. So passing this information around actually isn't that difficult. What I do here is when I get a click item, I go ahead and I create my intent, like I always have. And since I'm getting the parent view, the card view, I don't want to transition the entire card view. That's not going to exist on the next page. So I simply call find view by ID, and I get that image that's inside of that card view. And now I can pass and bundle up a few additional options to tell the activity transitions what to do. And in this case, I say make scene transition animation, give it the context, the actual view that I would like to move to the next page, and that identifier. That means you could specify multiple of these as well in your bundles. You might have different things for different pages, is what I'm saying. So it might not be album on every page.
And what's interesting, too, in that case is that, as you can notice, there is nowhere where you actually specified that the animation that you wanted to do was both a translation and also a scaling applied. This is all guessed out by the Android system, and it applies the right set of animation for the transition you're trying to do.
So that's activity transitions. I also want to talk a little bit about how they achieved that effect in the calculator, which was making the circular reveal animation, which is what I'm actually just going to show. I'm going to do something like this. I've slow-mode it down inside of here, but we're going to dive into the code of this one in the last few minutes that we have before we talk about compatibility. So here we go. Let's do explode one more time for fun. Whoa, so good. All right. So when I talk about circular, this is just a clear page, and my items are either hidden or visible on the page. And I want to somehow take it and expand and take a circular reveal of the entire grid. So when I press center here, you can see the monkey is being shrunk in and out and actually revealing itself from the center of the page. However, the effect that they were using in the calculator was an entire view that was hidden, that was made visible, that spread across the screen, something like this. And let me show you the code to do this and achieve it.
So this is following the same idea, if you remember when I talked about the ink, this idea of like dropping a piece of ink on the paper and having it propagate in a circle. This is the same idea. This is the idea that we're going to reveal things based on one point, a touch point, an epicenter that is usually also either some kind of user interaction with the view, or for instance, if what triggered the transition is at the bottom left of the screen, well, you expect the movement to also originate from that position and not from the top or not from any other direction.
Yeah. So we'll see a little bit of my backwards compatibility here in this example, where I'm doing some version checking to make sure, because these APIs are not going to be available if I'm targeting older platforms. So this activity wouldn't even launch because I'm stopping it here and returning and finishing. But what I have here is whenever I click on one of those buttons, so I have a animate button and animate from the bottom, which we saw bottom left per se, I simply hide or reveal. And that's what's going to make these animations. So this reveal method, so if it's not visible, I first make the image visible. Now we're still inside that same, process there that it's kind of calling this method. So what I can do is I can calculate, should I come from the center? So let's take the left and right and divide by 2. This is the center property. Where do I want to begin revealing this from? Or would I like to take it from the bottom left? So I have an X and a Y that I specify. This is where I'm going to start and reveal. And the final thing I get to do is give it a clipping circle. So what's my radius? Well, I just say give it the entire width. So you can specify how far you want this reveal to be. And now at this point, what they have exposed to us in our view animation utilities is a new create circular reveal. And I pass it the view, the X and Y, and the final width radius that I want to actually animate to, and I just start, and it handles it for me. So it's really just specifying where I want to start and go to, and where do I want to end at. And the same thing here for hide. This is all just common code I probably should have put somewhere, but at the same time, what I'm doing now is I'm saying create that circular reveal, but I'm switching the radius here, because we can see that this is going to be my start or end radius. So I'm going to say start at this end radius, and when I'm done, so when the animation ends that I've created, make it invisible. So I swap. That's all I'm doing, is just swapping my radius for start and end. So do I start or end at a specific width? And that's all the lines of code it is. Now I want to dive into compatibility. I could get into curve motion. We'll have it in our examples. Curve motion is pretty amazing. You've seen it a lot in our transitions of making something like that. It's really simple with a few lines of code, but I got 4 minutes left.
And if you're interested, I have another session Friday. This is the last session at 11, I believe, which is called Mastering Time and Space. And I'm going to go into those, or you can craft those beautiful, natural, exciting movement. So if you're interested also, come to see this session.
So when we come to compatibility, I think it's really important to step through just a few things, because Android is a little tricky. First is the CardView. We've seen it time and time again. You see it's exposed via a NuGet package just in the support v7 library. And the interesting part of CardView is that it's easy to implement. It's just a frame view. Think of it like a frame view. You can put whatever you want inside of it. It doesn't matter. It'll handle it for you automatically. It's themable, and it has two distinct properties in addition to normal styling that you can do, which is a card corner radius, so how much corner radius do you want, and also a background color that you can set. And we can see here on the right-hand side, I've selected different background colors for it. You can download this from the NuGet. Additionally, I want to talk about compatibility of list views in the few minutes that I have. So I think as a developer, not only has it been hard to design, but it's been really hard to make these smooth, buttery list views and grid views. So we always want to do something like this. We have all of our views up top, and we're scrolling down. We just want to recycle them. And of course, we're creating holders now, and then we're managing it. And our code looks something like this. And that's not good. So what Google has done with Android is they've created a recycler view. They've done all this view holder stuff, which is the right approach, but made it its own custom view, which you'll find inside of a support library. So it makes, I like to call them a super list view. It allows you to add and then animate across the board. Really silky smooth, and you'll find that in our examples. In fact, if you do the mini hack for the Android player, you'll see that I'm using a recycler view in that example and scrolling through hundreds of items. But even on top of that, it's been really hard to do these animations. And the biggest part that I like to talk about recycler view is that with one line of code, you can animate in and out items automatically, which we can see here where I'm adding and removing them.
And so for the little story, this control was made by one of the Google engineer called Chet Haas, who is one of the main engineers that worked on all the graphic subsystem of Android. And so he has also produced, he loves to like do talks and produce a lot of content and tutorials. And one of the theme that was always coming back is that people wanted to do animation with list views. And list views was made in a time where this was completely out of the picture, never made for that. So every time he had to explain something, he had to do those horrible acts, trying to keep the view alive. It was horrible. So basically one day he was so sick of it that he decided, I'm going to just throw everything away and create recycler view. So this is why it is now much, much, much easier now to apply animation to this control.
And it's relatively easy to upgrade your list views as well. You just have to move around some view holder code. Now, these new APIs that we talked about, backwards compatibility, obviously Material Theme is only available on Android L Developer Preview and Android L when it releases. So you'll want to do due diligence to place your resources in the correct folder. With Android, you're allowed to obviously specify different dips, so XHDPI, XXHDPI. You can do the same thing with any folder for a specific version number. So you'd want to replace all of your material themes or material assets in a -v21, which is Android L. And the same thing with layouts or the themes. So layout -v21, values -v21. The animations that we showed here, those are only going to be Android L. So again, do due diligence to wrap those in an SDK integer check, including reveal, touch feedback as well. Now the card view, we talked about a little bit. And this is all the way back to v7. And it's exposed via a support library. It has a few limitations for pre-L devices. Now, L devices will take advantage of all the hardware goodness and built into L. For backwards compatibility, you're going to use some pragmatic shadows that have been optimized for each platform. And the one thing to know is that it does not clip children that intersect with rounded corners. So a little bit of an intricacy there. I think you want to talk in the last 22 seconds about distributing.
This is going to be a race. This is going to be a race. OK, I'm going to wait until 10 seconds. OK, maybe not. The fact about distributing material design is that, again, stressing out the fact that this is only a preview. So this is not made for production at the moment. And so the gist is essentially that Google will not allow you to send your application if either your Min SDK or your Max SDK version is targeting L. So the only way you can today take a little bit of advantage and ship an app, take advantage of the L feature and also ship an app, is to use what James has been showing, which is not, you do not directly set your app to be runnable on L, but you use those specific layouts to tap into it.
And then to get the design specification, this is where you need to go. Google.com/design/spec. This is everything we've been talking about from the Google designers. So when you think about it, James and Jeremy did an amazing job explaining this, obviously. But also, if you want to deep dive and get the full PDF sheet, it's like a huge book, basically, of everything that you can dive into. With that, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll be around for questions so they can set up, so we'll just come right over here.